if you are to open up any streaming platform just now, particularly Netflix, you will be assaulted with nearly nothing but Christmas movies, and particularly romantic comedy Christmas movies, which seem to have exploded in popularity. Victoria and I tried to watch one this week, and I think we got about 10 minutes in. It was just such nonsense that we couldn't possibly continue, because they're deliberately quite shallow and sickly, and they kind of don't make any secret of what they are, or pretend to be more lofty than they are. But ultimately, they revolve around the very human emotion of love, and particularly love as an emotion, and something that comes together perfectly at Christmas time. And it's not the whole picture. And what I really like about passages like the one we get in Jeremiah is it shows the love of God in such a deep and such a substantial way. So I'm going to do what I can to try and draw that out. Jeremiah, we were thinking about Isaiah the last few weeks, and the story about Israel and their highs and lows, and the prophetic sort of hope they were given in the midst of that. And Jeremiah is a really similar book. Jeremiah's got a hard task. He is prophesying not long before the southern kingdom, Judah, eventually gets completely carted off and exiled. And he's trying to give them the message that could still be averted, but we know from history, he's on a hiding to nothing, because they do get exiled. So this is really sort of the 11th hour stuff. But what you'll find interesting is that even though Jeremiah's alive and he's prophesying before Israel gets exiled and punished for their waywardness and their abandoning of God, this little section in the middle of it, Jeremiah from chapters 30 to 32, is often called the Book of Comfort, because it is God speaking to the prophet in a way that is looking beyond the punishment and the exile, and is looking very far forward into the future when God is going to redeem them as a people despite that. So it's an enormous amount of foresight and an enormous amount of hope. I want to look at God's love in all seasons, really, because what he says to them here is that God's love is present despite their past faithlessness, that God's love is there in the present wilderness that they find themselves in when they're exiled, and that God's love will be there to give them future blessings. And so there's a totality within these first few verses of Jeremiah 31. Well, firstly, he tells them about God's love for them despite past waywardness or faithlessness. The people, he says, who survive the sword will find favor in the wilderness. I will come and give rest to Israel. He also says to them, I've loved you with an everlasting love and drawn you with unfailing kindness. And then later on, he speaks in language that will really make us think of other parts of the Bible where God makes himself known to people at a time of weakness. I am Israel's father, and Ephraim is my son. I will bring them from the land of the north and gather them from the ends of the earth. So much of what not Isaiah, but he does it too, Jeremiah focuses on in his language is trying to reimagine the fact that them being exiled is similar to the Exodus. Two ideas are kind of really similar. But the idea behind that is a kind of a wandering, of a lostness. And especially when I was reading that verse about I am Israel's father and Ephraim is my firstborn son, that gives you the idea that even though those people have gone far away in their hearts and in their practice, remember, Israel's in a real mess. They're offering sacrifices to other gods. They have no system of justice or equity. So if you happen to be disadvantaged in this society, you're probably going to find yourself slipping to the very bottom with nobody to plead your cause, to be able to stand up on your own 2 feet. So there's no justice. They're in a ruinous position as a society. And despite that, God is saying they've done all of this and they've gotten themselves here, and I'm not going to give up on them. It's like a child that he cannot stop loving or give up on. And any of us who have been parents will know that love does get tested a lot And particularly into adulthood. Sometimes that's when even, I've pastoral conversations with people all the time, and maybe their kids were quite good for most of their life, and then something happened in their adult life, and they're having to go back to square one and care for them a lot. And the tests of that bond and love can be enormous. And God is relating to all of us on that level and saying that's how he loves his people. Because Israel have made a complete mess of they were given a choice when they entered the land. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, there are two paths of life. There's curses and there's blessings. And they chose the way of curse, and they chose the way of degradation and further estrangement from God. And he's saying, despite that, can you think of a story that Jesus uses in the New Testament to get this through to how God cares for people who have wandered a long way off? In fact, you can probably think of a couple of stories, but particularly of a good and a loving father who does not give up on his children and waits for them to come back. Or indeed, the picture's even stronger here. He draws back his children with his love. There's an inescapableness of it. Or it's a bit like the good shepherd going and searching on the hillside for his lost sheep that he loves so much, and he's not willing to let them stay out there and be abandoned. In fact, when he says, I have loved you with an everlasting love, I have drawn you with unfailing kindness. The Hebrew words behind that are so beautiful, they're so strong. It's a love and a kindness that God has that he's unable to stop giving. He's unable to stop hoping on his people. He draws them. That same word is used when, the story of Joseph and his brothers, and they throw him into the pit, and eventually he's drawn up out of it, and that starts his journey where he's going to be redeemed from that lowest point possible. That is the same language that's being used here. What's the implication of that? It doesn't matter how wayward and how far Israel went, God was always going to make a way to draw them back to himself, and he was going to be the one who would reach down and rescue them and give them hope for a future, as he is doing here. And it doesn't matter about their past waywardness and faithlessness. I think that is the essence of the gospel, and I think it's incredibly good news at Advent time, but it's incredibly good news all year round, because that means, by implication, for you and me, that it doesn't matter where we have been. It doesn't matter, maybe we find ourselves off the path and not walking with God for a long time. Maybe we find ourselves disillusioned with either God or church or religion, and I can well understand how that could happen. Maybe we find ourselves in open rebellion and hostility towards God and wanted nothing to do with him. Maybe we feel like we have lots of lost years and lost time that we can't get back. And what I want you to see is the power of the image that God uses, that he has been drawing you. And there's an inescapable nature to it, because for those whom he has set his love on, there's nothing that's actually able to stop him drawing them in and resting in his love despite where they've been. And so they're able to let down all their excuses and all their thoughts of, well, we couldn't possibly be good enough. Well, yes, he's very clear that they haven't been good enough, but that's not the deciding factor. The deciding factor is the strength and the force of God's love. I will draw you with unfailing kindness. And so his love covers their past. And then his love is there for them in what is a difficult and a dark present. The people who survive the sword. So it's talking about, an exile's never, it's a hostile foreign power coming in, quite often pillaging the entire area. As we're seeing in the Middle East just now, war is always deeply unpleasant when there are nations fighting over land and territory. And then he says this whole phrase that's just amazing. They will find favor in the wilderness. Now he's bringing them again back to the Exodus, and he's thinking, when you were delivered out of Egypt, then you found yourself in this dry wilderness, and you thought, well, we're probably going to die here now because there's no hope in a place like this. The wilderness is where things and people go to die. And he's saying, despite the fact that you find yourself here, that you're lost, that you're off the path, that doesn't mean that I'm not here. He says, I will come in that very situation to give rest to Israel. Rest is one of the greatest promises that actually God gave his people in Deuteronomy when he was setting them up on their new course in their new land. There's this whole idea in the Old Testament that to be blessed by God is to be in the land that he's promised to them, that he's given them. And that's where all the good things happen. And being in the land becomes a bit of a metaphor. It means so much more. It's a bit like we say today that if you're going somewhere great like the Isle of Lewis, that you're going to God's country kind of thing. That's the same way that in the land functions in the Old Testament. And what God is now saying here is that even though you're not in the land, even though you find yourself in this wilderness where there's not a path, there's not an obvious way, where there's not much life, I'm still there. And I'll come and I'll give you rest there and I'll provide for you. Which is a tale as old as time. God had provided in the wilderness, but sometimes Israel weren't always good at keying in because they quite often thought, well, if we're not in the land, that means we're under God's curse and there's no hope of receiving any of his goodness or his blessing. I think we quite often do the same thing. I think we go through seasons of life and we think, I'm doing well in this season and I'm on top of things, and that hopefully means God's a bit closer and blessed. I think all humans do this. They think that we intuitively think blessing is earned by how well we're doing. And God is saying, despite the fact that you might be in the wilderness, or even more so for us, despite the fact that you might be in a path and a place in life that you're not sure if God is there, and you perhaps don't feel his presence very much at all, perhaps in a way that you used to, that doesn't mean that his love is not there. His love may have even taken you to a kind of wilderness experience, because as Jesus was tempted and tried in the wilderness, sometimes there is a path like that for us, and it's only for a season. Sometimes we interpret our circumstances. Maybe we're going through something of a wilderness, a dark night of the soul, some struggle that we wouldn't have chosen, and it feels huge and insurmountable. And we conclude from that God has given up on us, or it's some sort of punishment from him. And yes, Israel are reaping the consequences of walking away from God and creating a horrible society. But despite that, it doesn't mean that God is not there. Because he says to them, even in the wilderness, he will come and give them rest. And one of the most important things we can know for ourselves in our Christian walk and journey is that even in those seasons where we think God might have forgotten us and abandoned us, that even then he is there. As David says in Psalm 139, where can I go to escape your presence and your love? If I fly to the heavens, you are there. If I take the morning wings and dwell out in the depths of the ocean, even still your love will surround me. It's impossible to escape. And so it is always with us in our present, even though we can't feel it and perhaps don't experience it. It doesn't negate the fact that God is there and his love continues to surround us. And then he's given them an assurance that his love covers their past, that his love is with them in their present, despite what they might think is evidence to the contrary. And then he gives them this hope of his love being there to bless them in the future. I will build you up again, from verse 4, and you will plant vineyards on the hills of Samaria and enjoy their fruit. Now, what's the significance of that? In the Old Covenant, if they were to plant vineyards in the land, the first 4 years were set aside as the kind of holy fruit, bounty for God. And then there was like a 5th year of fallowness and resting, and then they would be able to enjoy the fruit beyond that. So by God giving them this message that there is a day coming where they are going to be settled enough and at peace enough where they can do that for the 4th and the 5th year and then be able to enjoy their fruit, he's giving them hope and some vision that I love you and that my future plan is to bless you in a settled and in a stable way. which, when you think about it, is a message they really needed when they were going through so much turmoil and instability, when there are so many questions on what God has done with his promises and his plans to bless them and to be their God and they will be his people, and how is that going to work? There's all these, I think Jeremiah's got Deuteronomy, the book, open in front of him as he's writing this, because there's again that idea in Deuteronomy that part of God's blessing, the way it'll be known and seen, is their livestock will be fruitful, their vineyards and their crops will be fruitful, and that's how they'll know that God has really blessed them. And that's all there. And God is saying that this might be a long way in the future, but for people who are wandering around and are struggling to retain their identity because they're under siege and they're looking at the prospect of deportation and whatnot, I don't think, where's God in all of that? God plans to bless us and to settle us, and for a day to be coming where our people will once again enjoy the fruit that God promised. Now, a lot of this is poetic, but it doesn't matter, because the same truth is what he's getting across, that you don't need to worry about the future, because my love is there for you as a people too, and I continue to plan to bless you even beyond what your present circumstances look like. And the same hope carries over into the New Testament and at Christmas time, because the love of God comes to us in Christ, and if it doesn't give us anything else, it gives us an assurance that God's love is going to continue to have an impact in our lives and in the world. That God's love will increasingly fill us and this world and settle the distractions and the disputes and the conflicts and the despair and all the things that make this world such an awful place to be. And so we have him with this totalizing picture, this love that encapsulates and surrounds our whole being, a love that lets us know that I have been with you, and even when you thought you were disqualified from being in any way a partaker of my love, I was there and I was showing you that I would lead you back to myself. I am with you in the present, despite how much you may or may not feel like I am there. And I have plans to bless you in ways that you might not feel realistic at this moment, because my love with you will go into the future. And ultimately, as I often share at funerals, the Christian hope is that we share in and dwell in the love of God forever, even beyond the temporal circumstances of our lives, because Christ has come and promises to never leave his own. So may God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.